Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carruth Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1986 war film titled Platoon. Now, Platoon runs for 2 hours long. It is written and directed by Oliver Stone. It is produced by Arnold Kopelson. This movie was actually written originally as a screenplay back in 1968 by Oliver Stone, and it was actually titled Break. That's how this movie actually came about. It was, for a long time, rejected by many film studios because of their misconceptions into believing that this was an anti war film and that it might have been controversial to the public. So, this film was laid on the cutting room floor for several years before Orion Films decided to pick it up and decided to go with it. The score was done by Georges Delerue, the cinematography by Robert Richardson, and the editing was done by Claire Simpson. And the stars of the movie are Charlie Sheen, Tom Berenger, who was nominated for a Best Supporting Actor here, Willem Dafoe, who also was nominated in the Best Supporting Actor category as well. We have Keith David, John C. McGinley, Kevin Dillon, Francisco Quinn. We have the Candyman himself, Tony Todd. He was in it. We also have Forrest Whittaker, who, of course, would later go on to become an Oscar winner himself for The Last King of Scotland. And we also have the legendary Johnny Depp in one of his more earlier roles. Now, I guess you could say that in this movie, if you really want to know about the Vietnam War, I guess the best thing you have to do is to be in the war. And that is exactly what writer director Oliver Stone did. This is his personal metaphorical memoir, which is basically what this movie was about. It was about his experiences in the war, the horrors, and the general friction, not just within the Vietnam or the Viet Cong soldiers, but the war amongst fellow Americans. And of course, the Vietnam War was not necessarily soldiers per se that entered the war. It was just basically students who recently graduated from high school. You weren't given really very many options in the 60s and 70s. If you were a high school student and you graduated, you have to do one of two things. You can either go to university and get an education, pick a career, or you go straight to Vietnam. And they didn't really give a fuck if you have military training. You go you go there and you kick ass. Or you could come back home in a box. And then you'll have a whole bunch of family members crying at your funeral. The choice is yours. Sitting on your ass is not an option. Now, for a rather powerful film, Platoon seems to be permanently stuck in the 1980s. It's still very much a trendsetter that inspired other war themed films to follow. Even though they have emulated the theme of war, it can never be fully duplicated. This probably is about as good as it gets in terms of realism. So, yes, Platoon still succeeds in capturing the fear, the unpredictability, and the uncertainty that comes into effects when you're in the war. However, Oliver Stone's other war themed follow ups become more stylized in contrast to the substance that this film delivers. Born on the 4th of July. I think there was also another one which I just can't seem to get into my head right now, but I remember Born on the 4th of July. And then, of course, there were other war themed films that just does not seem to get the proper gist. Because let's face it, Oliver Stone was in this war. Oliver Stone knows the ins and outs of what happened there. So I guess it was apropos that he would write the script and he would direct the movie. And I think he was the right choice for it. The visceral effects seems to be more personal due to the horrors director Oliver Stone faced during his time in Vietnam. The characters depicted here have the emotions to convince you that these soldiers are fearing their lives and know they could come out of the war as either heroes or as rotting corpses. There's no escape, no matter what. And even if you do come out, are you going to get the hero's respect? Are you going to get the accolades and the bravado that you truly deserve once you get out of the war? Not necessarily. Many people who had I've heard many stories about people who had came out from the Vietnam War and they got shabby treatment. I mean, even though this was a fictional story, but John Rambo could probably be the great personification to exemplify that. Now, long before Rambo actually uh became an action film, First Blood, the first one, the first of the John Rambo movies, that one was more of a dramatization than an action film, and it depicts a Vietnam War soldier who ends up becoming virtually condemned and becomes at war with civilians rather than just wanting to settle down and be left alone. I mean, if you're not going to respect me, at least leave me be type of thing that he had to go through, which eventually led to him showing misanthropy. But that's kind of like just a primary example of what a lot of soldiers from the Vietnam War went through. They come back, and it's like, who really gives a fuck? You were in a war that really meant nothing, so therefore, you have no military experience. You didn't come home with a bunch. You may have come home with a bunch of badges around you, but what did it all add up to? Absolutely, positively nothing. And that's kind of like the sad truth about a lot of soldiers in Vietnam War. A great song that could depict the shabby treatment that Vietnam War veterans went through would have been um, Bruce Springsteen's opus, Born in the USA. You may think that the song sounds kind of patriotic, but it's actually really a lot more cynical with a lot more darker undertones depicting how soldiers were treated once they came back from the Vietnam War. Not very pleasant. So anyhow, let's go back to the story here of Platoon. Charlie Sheen stars here as Chris Taylor. He is a college flunky who is from a posh upbringing. He arbitrarily enlists into the military, feeling that the underclass should not be the only ones fighting in the Vietnam War, which shows little significance towards his allies, who accurately say that only the rich could convey such an attitude. Sheen doesn't have the impression or the range as Taylor from the inexperienced novice to the grizzled veteran, he never really sparks any kind of adequacy, which makes this movie at times very distracting. It's like we start off with him in 1967, and then we segue to 1971, and he's pretty much virtually the same person from from his early times in the Vietnam War to his later times. It's like he still seems pretty wide-eyed, and he still just does not seem to embody that leadership quality that he needed. I mean, he's pretty much still in the same predicament as he was before. No raises, no promotions, or anything like that. As times rolls on, Taylor becomes more respected by his troop, who ignores the fact that the other new recruits won't make it out alive, and we grow onto them, which is something the audience never really does. The platoon definitely is under the guidance of two superior sergeants whom have a lot of great admiration. We have the scar-faced, mean-tempered tyrant Sergeant Barnes, played by Tom Berenger, and we have the more level-headed but effective commando Alias, played by Willem Dafoe. Now you can tell that these two sergeants are very, very similar to the fact that they are tough and that they are willing and they are dedicated in their craft. But the fact of the matter is that Barnes is brutal. He's tyrannical and he shows little to no remorse for his actions, whereas Elias is able to take a step back and to reconsider his thoughts before striking. Whereas Barnes, he's a go-getter. He's gonna go. He's gung ho. He's gonna go out and he's gonna kick some ass, and he doesn't give a fuck who he steps on. And if you get in his way, you're dead. Whereas Elias is like, well, let's take before I strike. Let's sort of reconsider our thoughts. Let's go through some plans, some strategies. I mean, he can hold him. I mean, Alias could hold himself back, whereas Berenger, he can't. I mean, the guy might probably be clinically insane for all we know. And meanwhile, Alias can probably might be able to survive in the regular world. Berenger excels quite well as the brutish soldier who seems like he was born into this lifestyle and probably may not adjust to the civilian life. Both Berenger and Dafoe were nominated for Best Supporting Actors at the Oscars, only to be humbled by Michael Caine for Hannah and Her Sisters. Nothing against Hannah and Her Sisters. It was a great movie, but I think that, you know, both Berenger and Dafoe were placed on the short end of the stick. And I think this movie truly should have went to either Dafoe or Berenger or both of them because they were just so effective in their roles. Barnes and Elias's friendship falls out when the borderline insane Barnes threatens to kill a Vietnamese lady who may or may not be helping Viet Cong fighters, which eventually leads to a divinity within the platoon, which Taylor likes to awkwardly describe as their own personal civil war. And instead of concentrating on the Viet Cong, they seem to be pretty much at war with themselves. Which means that this movie has quite a lot of believability to it. and that's fine. I mean, if you think of movies that kind of glorify the war, everybody seems to get along, everybody seems to be la di da, happy go. When really, if you really want to know something, there was a lot of intensity within platoons or um within military factions. And sometimes the wars within themselves often led to their own demise. And the worst part is we believe Oliver Stone because, like I said before, he been through it. So we have to believe him. We don't have a choice here. We have no choice. I mean, sure, of course, maybe there might be some dramatization that was going on. After all, it's a movie. It's not necessarily a true story, but it does reflect a lot of realism because we have a man who experienced it all. So we really can't say that this movie is complete bullshit because it isn't. However, though, the loose formatting of Platoon is that we see a cornucopia of unrelated occurrences of grunts and the endless chatter about how long before their tour of duty will come to a conclusion. The movie lures into the daily regiments that the soldiers go through in their endless quest for survival. The battles with the enemy is illustrated with realism, along with the constant reminder that heroism or death are the only options in this war. The physical and psychological wounds is vintage in terms of storytelling, but it's Oliver Stone's choice of music that seems to somewhat be highly questionable. Sure, we have some of the old 60s psychedelic stuff, like the Jefferson Airplanes, White Rabbit, and a few other hippie stuff that we used to listen to in the 60s. Uh, we have, of course, some Jim Morrison and the Doors, and I believe it or not, back in 1968, when Oliver Stone actually wanted to make this into a movie, he actually did have in mind of selecting Jim Morrison to perform in there. But of course, it was on the cutting room floor, and since Jim Morrison, uh, of course, he sadly passed away, so it was left on the cutting room floor for over 15 years. And yeah, they had to go through a whole bunch of new performers. Well, at least newer performers. And which I'll talk about the performances a little bit. But like I said, the soundtrack of some of the songs was a bit questionable. The adagio of String's song feels really, really out of place, and it more or less hinders the scenes as opposed to contemplating towards them. I just really didn't like too much of the score there. Yeah, like I said, we have our Jefferson airplanes with the White Rabbit and a few of the other 60s stuff. I guess that kind of makes sense. I mean, hey, the Vietnam War was a war that took place between 1964 and it didn't end until 1975. So it makes sense that we would have those put on there. I mean, Apocalypse Now, we had the Doors once again, and we had a few other hippie anti-war songs, and all this free sex and smoke some good joints. But hey, it's the '60s, man. You gotta get groovy. Well, this movie does have that as well. And those songs are used to effectiveness. I'm not saying it's all a complete debauchery, but it really seems out of place. The adagio strings didn't think it really fit in. This is just minor quibbles, by the way. The narration is definitely seen through Taylor's letters, especially to his ailing grandmother, who must have been really giddy over his cheery sentiments about if his sanity is intact or his doubts of making it in his war. But I do found that his letters often at times look as if it was written by a junior high student coping with the anxieties in the classroom rather than a man in the middle of what is practically the threshold of hell. And as much as I hated to see this scene, but I also felt that Elias's death tends to be vastly overplayed, loosely inspired by the 1968 picture of the soldier aiding a helicopter to the ground, which definitely totally runs its welcome. And yes, I know there was also a little bit of a wink regarding the movie The Last Temptation of Christ, which actually ironically has Willem Dafoe in, but his death when he spreads his arms out, it almost looked a bit like Jesus Christ when he was crucified to the cross and how he had his arms spread out. During his death scene, which was really very overly dramatized, you see his arms spread out, which is kind of an ironic thing because in 1988, or was it 89, Willem Dafoe actually played the Lord Jesus Christ in the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. So, was it possible that Martin Scorsese must have seen the movie and, I guess maybe during the time when he was making The Last Temptation of Christ, he was trying to look for somebody to play Jesus. And then when he saw Alias's death scene, he was like, I want Willem Dafoe. Maybe that's kind of like what Martin Scorsese had in mind. Because Alias's death is so ironic to Jesus crucified to the cross that Scorsese was like, get me Dafoe once this movie's over. And that's kind of like the impression I get. I mean, sure, his death scene was epical, and it was painful to watch, just like a lot of the stuff that we've seen in the movie, which is normal, being that this is a Vietnam War movie, and there's really nothing pleasant to watch. But I just thought his death scene was too overplayed, and it was too over the top. I mean, he could have just simply died by way of maybe saying a few last words before uttering his last few breaths, and that would have been much more effective. That's basically all I'm saying. The strong points in Platoon are really handled well, is the stress of these average soldiers face when heading to the front line. The Viet Cong are depicted as semi-invisible ghosts using their mind games to inject fear, and it is handled very convincingly. But the Viet Cong are basically just pushed into the background since the main emphasis is on the platoon and the war that they had amongst themselves. So, in the scene where the platoon invades a village and destroys it and annihilates the people, serves a purpose. In the midst of the battle, we see the fear, the pressure, and the determination in which leads the troop to the brink of madness. And even Taylor himself often questions if whether his sanity is still intact or not. Obviously, Barnes Barnes is gone off. O'Neill is pretty much gone off. A lot of the other people, like the Redneck Bunny and a few other people, they also seem to be either under the hypnotic feel that their sanity is off, and even some of their approach to their time in Vietnam is quite cynical because oftentimes they're often contemplating about their funeral or how they want their loved ones to be remembered, as though as if they doubt that they're gonna survive this whole ordeal. And that's what a lot of the soldiers, I could imagine, were thinking. And I'm sure this is exactly what Oliver Stone must have been through. But of course he did. I mean, he was there. I wasn't, so I wasn't even born yet. But I could imagine what they must have went through. Not a pretty picture. I never said this was a pretty picture. Sure, it won for Best Picture, and it won for, I don't know if it won. I think it was nominated for Best Director. I mean, it had to. Come on. I mean, this is about as real as it gets. Everything else becomes glorified. This one is nothing glorified. This is about as real as it gets. So never mind your Top Guns or your Born on the 4th of July or your Good Morning Vietnams. This is real. And we are all in the middle of this, whether we like it or not. It's just a reminder to the environment in which these soldiers are facing, and it's an open invitation of what could happen if we were in their situations. So, in spite of its realism, there are flaws in this movie that kind of hold this movie back. Overall, I thought the performances were really good, especially Charlie Sheen. I mean, Charlie Sheen gets shit faced on a lot, but I think he really excelled well, pretty much almost following his father's legacy from his 1979 movie Apocalypse Now. Char- the younger Sheen is just following Pappy's footsteps. Once again, I thought the acting from Tom Berenger and Willem Dafoe were excellent. Also, the performances from John C. McGinley as the cowardly Sergeant O'Neill was great. It was nice to see Johnny Depp play a character role where he isn't a complete weirdo, even though his role was pretty small. Forrest Whittaker, he was also quite good in as well. Tony Todd makes you just completely forget Daniel Robitaille, aka the Candyman. He was pretty good there. Kevin Dillon may have been a little bit over the top with his southern accent as Bunny, but he still added some believability to his performance. And like I said, once again, hats off to Oliver Stone for creating such a realistic drama. So, in spite of the flaws, it does take a few points back because of the questionable score and and at times some of the situations you faced. It's very dated, so that also gets a few points off. But it's still a good watch, and I still highly recommend it. And if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give Platoon a 7. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. Just remember, be kind, be courteous, and don't be rude. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Correct Writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.